Around a year ago, I met a very interesting man who eventually became a good friend to me. I'll call him Chris to protect his identity. We both have a military background, so naturally, we spoke about some of our exploits in those past lives. He had an unexpectedly haunting story to tell, and when I later got this channel up and running, I asked if I could share it with you. So, here we go. This took place on an undisclosed military base located in the damp jungles of a remote island. Chris says he remembers the wilderness being unnervingly quiet for at least a week leading up to the incident. The personnel stationed there chalked the silence up to a change in seasons or something. There had been reports of bizarre sightings, fast-moving animals no one could explain. Anyone who mentioned them was typically shut down with ridicule from fellow soldiers. The sightings were notably inconsistent with one another. Some saw large eyes, others saw small ones. Some heard a big thing trudging boisterously through the woods. Others heard the sounds of something small and light sneaking around in the bush. No one had seen anything worth defending in an inevitable argument, let alone losing their reputation over. Chris heard every report due to the fact he was the desk sergeant at the time. Anyone who saw or heard something off, which could potentially impact the security of the base, would typically come to him to have it noted in the log. He never took the more fantastical reports seriously enough to actually write them down, unbeknownst to the concerned soldiers who came to him. Some of them came to just talk about what had happened, off the record, anyway, which would typically end up with them trading ghost stories. On the night in question, Chris and his team were on the far side of the island, an area which was completely uninhabited, where no human presence could be found for hundreds of miles in every direction. For that reason, the military chose that location for storing their weapons and explosives. Chris and a partner, who we'll all call Barry, were conducting the nightly checks on the magazine storage areas, which lay several miles deep into the uninhabited zone. The jungle was still weirdly quiet, but it was good for them, being that their mission was to detect foreign intelligence or operatives tampering with U.S. equipment, or the occasional refugee group that was washing ashore. They were on a road that rested in the valley of two mountains, bordered by gigantic hills, thick and rocky with tall grass. As they drove slowly with their Humvee windows down, they heard a heavy thud coming from the woods. A totally unexpected, unnatural sound emanated clearly from the tangled growth. The first thud drew their attention, but was quickly followed by other noises. Barry shut off the headlights and shut off the engine so they could sneak up on whoever was out there. They knew anyone attempting to navigate the dense vegetation would have to do so carefully, taking time to avoid injury. But, surprisingly, they could hear fast-paced walking, rustling through the tall grass. After a few moments, the sound began to move parallel to the road. They restarted the vehicle and started to pursue the noise. The walking continued for a while as they followed it with their only running lights on, before suddenly stopping. They had first thought they'd lost track of whatever it was, so they turned the headlights back on, assuming it was a deer or something, and had continued a distance down the road. As Barry proceeded to turn the high beams on, both men noticed something in the distance. Approximately 30 yards ahead, a humanoid creature jumping into the road and then into the bush on the other side. It was gray, over 2 meters tall with a small, oval head. Its movements were too swift for its size. The best way he could describe it was a leaping motion that you'd see from a nimble frog. Seeing the creature instantly gave Chris the feeling of being punched in the stomach. His heart sank so rapidly and my adrenaline kicked in so fast that he began to feel nauseous, on the verge of vomiting. He laments the fact that neither of them had the will to chase after the creature, but that the feeling of being at such a disadvantage was absolutely petrifying. The idea that they were stalking it raised the question, were they hunting or being hunted themselves? Whatever it was, the monster definitely had the tactical advantages of position and mobility. Chris and Barry turned their truck around and sped off into the night. The woods remained silent for at least another week, returning to the normal droning sounds of the local wildlife. My name is Tom. I wanted to share a story with you I've kept to myself for many years. In all this time, it's been both a haunting memory and in some ways, oddly, a pleasant one. I live in Alabama, but my family's roots run deeply in Ireland. My grandparents have been telling me stories about the Fae of Celtic legends since I was 5 years old. Leprechauns, changelings, fairies, and the subject of this story, the Banshee. I always took my grandparents at their word, assuming the legends to be true, up until my teenage years when I became a bit too grown up to believe in these things, or so I thought. As I'm sure you've guessed by now, there came a time when I was forced to see that I was wrong. The night before my high school graduation, my grandfather passed away due to a heart attack, and I had to open my eyes to the legends once again. That very night, I became a true believer. Needless to say, I didn't make it to my graduation ceremony, opting to stay with my grandmother and keep her company. She was understandably broken up. At about 2 a.m, 5 hours after my grandfather's passing, I decided to sneak out to the front porch of my grandmother's rural home for a quick cigarette while everyone else was asleep. The night was cold and dimly lit by a full moon. After the first drag from the cigarette, the gravity of the situation hit me, and I lost it. Tears streamed down my face as I contemplated life without the man I grew up loving. All the memories came flooding in like a tidal wave crashing at the shores of my mind. It took me a while to cool down, but eventually, I was able to collect myself. Just as the feeling of flushed out emotional energy started to wash over me, I heard the most bone-chilling scream I've ever heard in my life. My head darted frantically, straining to find something to pick out in the low light. My eyes caught on a splotch of paleness not far away from the house. It was long, flowing white dress. As I scanned upward, analyzing the unexpected figure, I could see strands of long, black hair dancing in the wind, obscuring the mysterious face of a woman. One word came to the forefront of my mind as I desperately searched for an explanation: Banshee. As I stared on, I noticed another figure standing next to the woman. After focusing my eyes on it, I could see clearly that it was my grandfather. He was right there, just meters away from me. 5 hours after he was taken by the ambulance to have his final wishes carried out, he gazed longingly toward the house while the woman stared away into the distance. I watched them, petrified for what seemed like an eternity, before the Banshee suddenly turned her head to lock eyes with me. My heart seemed to stop as the details of her legend came back to me. The Banshee was said to be something like an angel of death, appearing to signify the death of someone. Some say she appears to take lives. A few seconds later, she unleashed another unearthly scream as my grandfather raised his hand to bid farewell one last time. The two vanished before my eyes, leaving me alone in the darkness. After that night, the way I saw things was forever altered. I realized that the world we think we know is far too strange to make many hard claims. This event began what I strongly feel will be a trend in my life. I have this inkling that my future holds many more bizarre encounters. I've already had a few more after this. When I was about 10 years old, I went on a field trip with my 4th grade class to a summer camp. For the most part, it was a typical experience: rafting, bad food in the mess hall, hiking, campfires, etc. Now, one of my friends did a typical movie thing and brought a dirty magazine from home. We were supposed to be there for 4 days. I only lasted about 2. It was late at night, since I stayed there to do trash duty and clean the mess hall. After I picked up the final granola bar wrapper, I made my way to the showers to clean up before turning in for the night. Halfway through, I hear a loud shuffling sound outside the showers. I stop what I'm doing and listen intently, but the shuffling stops. I assume it's my friends pranking me as they typically do, and get out of the showers. Just to put this into perspective, the showers in the boys' cabins are a good walk away with no way to illuminate your surroundings. That's why they shower before dark and with groups, to make sure nobody gets lost. For someone like me who's by himself having to navigate his way through the woods, it's pretty fucking terrifying. To make matters worse, the flashlight I brought was back at my cabin. so I was stuck having to navigate my way back with a piece of shit lantern that barely gave me enough light. So anyway, I grab the lantern and start my walk to the cabins. About halfway through, I hear this ungodly loud moan coming from right the fuck in front of me. I panic and drop the lantern, running in the opposite direction of the sound. I can't see anything, and in my haste I fall on something. I examine the thing I fell on and realize it's squishy and soaking wet. I hear the moaning again from behind me and book it to the direction of the cabins. I'm instantly greeted by 3 flashlights and concerned looks. Apparently the other campers heard the moans, and the counselors went to investigate, only to find me, covered in head to toe in fucking blood. They brought me back to the cabins, and I'm immediately bombarded with questions about what I saw. My friends shut them up after a while. The next day I went home. Could you blame me? I was not going to stay there after the shit I'd been through. I almost forgot about this incident until a while ago when I was reminiscing about this with one of my friends who stayed at the camp. I asked him what happened after I left, and what he told me sent a shiver up my spine. Apparently after I left, the moans at night got louder and closer to the cabins and freaked everyone the fuck out. And as for that big mound I fell on, while the counselors were investigating the source of the moaning, they found a deer on the trail I was on. The head was ripped clean off, and its entrails were laying in a separate pile next to the carcass. That's my encounter. To this day, it remains the scariest experience I've ever had in my life. Everyone I've told this thinks I'm bullshitting, but my friends who were there that night always defend me. I still don't know what the fuck was in the woods that night. It's been over 6 years since this happened, but I still wake up in a cold sweat every now and then. I started using Reddit about 2 months ago, and just now discovered this subreddit. I think this would be a good place to share my experience, and ask if anybody knows what I encountered. I won't disclose where I went camping because I'm afraid it's still out there. I will say it's in the west region of America with some good forests. Anyway, let's get started. My at-the-time girlfriend, who's now my wife, and I were going through a tough time. Her father just died, and I had lost my license because of speeding. We needed something to take our minds off of everything, so we decided to go camping. We were both nature people, deal with it. After about 2 weeks of planning, we found a good time and spot. In that 2-week period, I managed to get my license back, so that was good. For this story, I won't give my girlfriend's real name for privacy reasons, so I'll refer to her as Elizabeth. We packed all the essentials we would need for a week out in the woods: tents, clothing, first aid kit, flashlights, a lighter, food, a cooler, knives, a machete, $150 for an emergency, playing cards, a guitar, etc. I brought a CZ USA 85 combat pistol just in case. Thank God I did. We packed all our things into the car, and we were on our way. I'll spare you the 4-hour drive. We stopped at a Burger King about 9 miles away from our destination to recharge our batteries and to stretch. Elizabeth pulled out her phone and looked at the weather, only to see that it was going to rain for the entire week. Great, now what are we gonna do? She asked. I guess we should get to the campsite to set up the tents before it's too late, I suggested. We did just that. When we got to the campsite, it started to rain a bit, so we started to unpack as fast as we could. While we were unpacking, we noticed that this campsite was recently used, and the people who were previously there had no respect for nature. There was garbage everywhere. Every third step you would hit a can of beer or a plastic bag, and I think at one point I saw an unopened box of tampons. The wind started to pick up too, so all the trash began to fly around in random directions. When we finally got the tent set up and things inside, the rain really started to come down. We managed to secure the tent well, but the rain fly almost blew off. While Elizabeth remained inside to set up the cots, I went out with my poncho and a hammer to secure the rain fly. While pounding the stakes into the ground, I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I don't know why. I just felt uneasy. It was as if something was watching me over my shoulder, and I didn't know. By now, it was getting pretty dark. If I had to guess, it was about 8:45-ish. I finished securing the rain fly and was about to head inside when I heard a howl a distance away. I thought it might be wolves, but it sounded off, like a cross between a scream from a human and a howl from a coyote. I got goosebumps. I headed inside and zipped the door shut. Elizabeth and I snuggled until we both fell asleep. For the next 2 days, nothing too eventful happened, but the third night is when it appeared. There was no rain that night either. As we were sleeping, I woke up to the same howl I had heard 2 days prior, but the thing that scared me the most is that it was closer. I shook Elizabeth's shoulder to wake her up. She gave me a partial half-asleep stare. "Babe, there's something out that..." I was cut off by the howl again, but now it was like 200 yards away. "Why is it coming towards us?" said Elizabeth with fear in her eyes. That's when it dawned on me. We left some food outside after making dinner. It was probably going for our food. We sat in the tent holding each other, shaking with fear in pitch black darkness. All of a sudden, we hear the howl again, but it was deafening. It was at our campsite. The thing kept making these noises and screaming for like 3 minutes, until Elizabeth sobbed into me making some noise. The thing stopped eating. It knew we were there. I embraced Elizabeth and started to silently cry too. This thing actually started to walk towards us. I thought, if I'm going to die here, I won't go down without a fight. I felt around for 2 things, my flashlight and my gun. I found those 2 things in about 2 seconds. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it into the direction the thing was. What I saw made me scream. I saw the silhouette of a creature the size of a full-grown German Shepherd, but way skinnier through my tent wall. But what scared me the most is that it stood up on its hind legs and began to touch the tent. I snapped out of it and took one shot at the thing. It let out the most haunting, blood-curdling scream. I can't even describe it in words. I kid you not, it turned around and ran away on 2 legs. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, fearing it might come back. Luckily, it never did, but we still heard its screams. At the crack of dawn, we grabbed all we could, jumped into my car, and drove out of the area as fast as we could. There was no time to dismantle the tent. We ended up staying in a hotel for the rest of the trip. That spare cash we brought was worth it. We ended up leaving half our stuff in the woods, but we didn't care. During the whole car ride out of the area, Elizabeth was crying and hugging my arm. After we returned home, we moved 1 month later. Elizabeth ended up going to therapy for 4 months to recover. We now have a baby boy and are living far away from our old home in the woods. We actually have a fear of camping now, but we live in a city now, so there's no problem. If anybody knows what we saw, please let me know, and may God return the thing we saw back to its home, hell.